In 1949, Mao Zedong promised a paradise of equality and power for the people of China. But behind the banners and slogans, he engineered something far darker. The eye-watering death toll of his rule, up to 70 million lives, makes Chairman Mao the deadliest criminal in history. A legacy built by starving villages, crushing dissent, and unleashing state terror on an unimaginable scale. What really happened during the Great Leap Forward and the blood-soaked decades that followed wasn't just policy failure. It was a deliberate system of mass starvation, torture, and extermination. If you think Mao's crimes are exaggerated, ask yourself, why do so many of his victims remain uncounted, their stories erased? This is The Savage Crimes of Chairman Mao Zedong. The truth that follows will shake every assumption you have about power, obedience, and what a single man can do when no one dares to say no. After the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, Mao Zedong set out to transform not only China's economy, but the very soul of its people. Overnight, the Communist Party replaced centuries of tradition with an all-encompassing system of control. Propaganda committees appeared in every city, town, and remote village, their task clear: root out old loyalties and instill absolute faith in Mao. Mass rallies filled public squares. Slogans thundered from loudspeakers, urging citizens to denounce the past and embrace a new order. At the heart of this new culture was the Speak Bitterness campaign. Landless peasants were summoned to accuse landlords and village elders before crowds, recounting grievances that often stretched back generations. These sessions were not spontaneous outpourings, but carefully orchestrated events, guided by party cadres who demanded public confessions, tears, and loyalty oaths. Those who hesitated risked being labeled enemies of the people. Children were instructed to inform on parents, neighbors on neighbors. The message was simple. Loyalty to Mao came before family, friendship, or conscience. By 1951, mass denunciations had become mandatory. In every province, local committees compiled lists of suspects: landlords, teachers, former officials, anyone with a connection to the old world. Public trials followed. Some ended with forced labor, others with execution. The violence was not hidden. It was staged in broad daylight, designed to terrify and educate. Those who cheered loudest at rallies were rewarded. Those who questioned, even quietly, found themselves next on the list. The machinery of control moved beyond the village square. Schools revised their textbooks, erasing histories and rewriting heroes. Newspapers and radio broadcasts repeated the same slogans, day after day, until resistance became unthinkable. By the late 1950s, Mao's vision of a new society was no longer a dream. It was a daily reality, enforced by millions of eyes and ears, each watching for the slightest sign of doubt. The foundation was set. A nation trained to obey, ready for whatever orders would come next. In 1958, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward with a single goal: to transform China from a rural, agrarian society into an industrial superpower overnight. The plan called for the creation of vast people's communes, each combining more than 5,000 households. These communes stripped families of their land, tools, and private plots, folding everything into collective ownership. Communal kitchens replaced home cooking. Children were raised in group nurseries while adults spent their days in the fields or at backyard furnaces, melting down pots, pans, and farm tools in a frantic push to meet steel quotas set by the central government. Steel production, not food, became the measure of loyalty. Local officials, desperate to avoid being labeled disloyal or rightist, inflated reports of both steel and grain output. These exaggerated numbers were sent up the chain, where they became the basis for new, even higher quotas. In Anhui province, where the mortality rate would reach 18%, cadres reported bumper harvests while villages emptied from hunger. When the real numbers fell short, officials faced public humiliation, demotion, or execution. Some tried to warn Beijing, but those who told the truth were denounced as enemies of the revolution. Many were shot or disappeared without a trace. As the countryside starved, the state continued to requisition grain from the communes. Trains loaded with rice and wheat rolled out of famine-stricken provinces, bound for cities or foreign ports. Export manifests from 1960 show that China shipped more grain abroad that year than in 1957, even as millions died at home. In Gansu and Sichuan, survivors remember soldiers guarding granaries while villagers begged for food outside. Attempts to divert grain back to the starving were met with lethal force. The labor diversion was relentless. Peasants spent long hours smelting metal, leaving fields untended. The Four Pests campaign, another central directive, targeted sparrows and disrupted the ecosystem, leading to crop-destroying insect swarms. By 1960, the countryside was gripped by silence, fields barren, villages emptied, and the dead buried in shallow graves. Mortality rates soared as high as 1 in 10 in the hardest-hit regions. Behind the facade of progress, the Great Leap Forward had become an engineered famine, enforced by fear and sealed by the state's refusal to admit failure. In the summer of 1966, Mao Zedong called on China's youth to bombard the headquarters. Within weeks, student groups calling themselves Red Guards swept through Beijing, Shanghai, and every major city armed with armbands and copies of Mao's Little Red Book. Their targets were clear: teachers, intellectuals, and anyone accused of holding on to old ideas. The violence began with public humiliation. Teachers were dragged from classrooms, their faces blackened with ink, forced to kneel for hours as students shouted revolutionary slogans. In the chaos, beatings became routine. Survivors recall being kicked, punched, and struck with wooden clubs. Some were paraded through the streets wearing dunce caps, their heads shaved, as crowds spat and jeered. The police had orders not to intervene. In August 1966, as the violence escalated, local security bureaus in Beijing and other cities received explicit instructions to stand aside. That month alone, at least 1,772 people were killed in Beijing, and more than 30,000 homes were ransacked. The streets filled with the battered bodies of those labeled class enemies. In Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Chongqing, similar scenes played out. Red Guards stormed homes, smashed family shrines, burned books, and destroyed priceless cultural relics. Those who tried to hide were hunted down. Old friendships and family ties offered no protection. Children denounced parents. Students turned on teachers. Neighbors informed on each other. By the end of 1967, thousands had died in street clashes and struggle sessions across China. The violence was not random. It was the product of a system that encouraged ordinary teenagers to become executioners in the name of revolution. With the police sidelined and party officials themselves under suspicion, there was no one left to stop the bloodshed. The message was clear. In Mao's China, the only law was loyalty to the leader, and the price of doubt was paid in blood. By the end of the 1950s, danger didn't just come from mobs in the streets. It crept into the highest echelons of the Communist Party. Mao Zedong, facing whispers of dissent, turned his focus inward. The Lushan Conference in July 1959 became a turning point. Defense Minister Peng Dehuai, a veteran of the Long March and one of Mao's oldest comrades, delivered a private letter. He warned of inflated harvest reports, food shortages, and the suffering spreading through the countryside. Peng's language was measured, careful not to blame Mao directly. But in Mao's eyes, the letter was betrayal. Within days, Peng was stripped of his titles and placed under house arrest. The message was unmistakable. Any criticism, no matter how loyal or private, would be punished as treason. Secret files began to circulate. The party's Central Committee compiled dossiers on those suspected of harboring doubts. Surveillance teams listened at doors, intercepted letters, and tracked conversations. Even the most senior leaders were not immune. Liu Shaoqi, once Mao's designated successor and the president of China, tried to steer the country away from disaster. In early 1962, he spoke at the 7,000 Cadres Conference, declaring that the famine was 30% natural disaster, 70% human error. The statement was recorded in official minutes, but it sealed his fate. Over the next few years, Liu was gradually isolated. His family was placed under house arrest. In 1968, he was formally purged, denounced as a traitor, and left to die in secret, denied medical care. The machinery of purges did not stop with the top. Across the provinces, lower-level officials who reported crop failures or questioned quotas found themselves reassigned, arrested, or worse. Some vanished into the Laogai camp system. The party's internal terror ensured that only one voice mattered. By the mid-1960s, disagreement had become a death sentence, and Mao's grip on power was absolute. Inside the Zhongnanhai compound, privilege took on a different meaning. For Mao Zedong, access to power meant access to people, especially young women. The state's cultural work troops, officially created to promote revolutionary arts, became a discreet recruitment pool. Party and military officials selected women from these troops, often presenting the opportunity as a patriotic duty or a career honor. But the real assignment was to serve Mao's personal desires. Dr. Li Jisui, Mao's personal physician, described a steady stream of new faces passing through the chairman's quarters. Some arrived believing they would perform music or dance. Others were told nothing at all. Refusal was not an option. Behind closed doors, threats circulated. Cooperation ensured a family's safety, while resistance could mean disgrace or worse. Medical records, kept under lock and key, documented a pattern of recurring venereal infections. Dr. Li treated Mao repeatedly, each time noting the arrival of new partners. The process was systematic. Women were vetted for health, coached in secrecy, and then dismissed without explanation. No official record of these arrangements survives in party archives. What remains is testimony from those who witnessed the machinery in motion, a network that blurred the line between personal vice and state policy. For the women conscripted, silence was enforced by fear. The state's reach extended beyond the palace walls, ensuring that what happened in the chairman's chambers would never become public knowledge. In Mao's China, even private exploitation operated under the shadow of absolute authority. Article 42 of the 1954 Constitution gave the Chinese state sweeping authority to compel labor in the name of reform. This legal pretext allowed the creation of the Laogai, reform through labor, a vast network of camps that stretched across every province. By the late 1950s, more than 1,000 facilities operated in secrecy, holding millions each year. Official records remain hidden, but survivor accounts and demographic studies estimate annual camp populations in the tens of millions, with mortality rates regularly exceeding 5%. In some years, the death toll soared even higher. Inside these camps, prisoners woke before dawn and worked until nightfall. quotas were set by camp officials, not by nature or skill, and failure meant punishment, reduced rations, beatings, or extra years added to a sentence. The labor itself fed China's industrial ambitions. Coal mines, brickworks, textile mills, and state farms all relied on forced labor to meet production targets. Survivors recall collapsing from exhaustion in fields or workshops, only to be dragged back to the line. Disease swept through overcrowded barracks, but medical care was almost non-existent. Inmates were told that only work could redeem them, yet the system was designed to grind them down. For political prisoners, the laogai was not just a punishment, but a warning to the rest of society. The state's message was clear. Dissent could end in a camp, and a camp could end in an unmarked grave. The industrial output of the laogai became a pillar of the national economy, built on the suffering and deaths of those the party deemed expendable. Between 1950 and 1952, China's countryside became the stage for a campaign of class extermination. Party officials arrived in villages with lists of names, landlords, their families, anyone who once owned land or hired labor. At mass accusation rallies, peasants were ordered to step forward and recount old grievances. These events, called denunciation fairs, were anything but spontaneous. Loudspeakers blared slogans and crowds were whipped into a frenzy. Once a landlord was singled out, the verdict was almost always death. Execution squads carried out sentences on the spot, their victims buried in hastily dug pits at the edge of the fields. In some provinces, entire family lines vanished overnight. The official record rarely mentions numbers, but in village after village, mass graves and missing generations tell the story. The message was unmistakable. Class origin alone could be a death sentence, and no one was safe from the new order. In 1958, as China expanded its military research, the People's Liberation Army established secret laboratories dedicated to biological studies. These facilities operated behind locked doors, with access limited to senior military doctors and trusted scientists. The work drew inspiration from the notorious Unit 731, whose legacy of human experimentation during the Japanese occupation loomed over post-war Asia. Inside these Chinese labs, researchers studied infectious agents like anthrax and smallpox, seeking ways to weaponize disease. While rumors circulated about human trials in sealed chambers, no verifiable records or declassified documents confirm systematic lethal testing on prisoners. Allegations of former Unit 731 personnel assisting Chinese programs remain unsubstantiated. What is known is that the regime invested heavily in biological warfare capabilities, treating human life as expendable in the pursuit of military advantage. The true extent of these experiments remains locked away, hidden by decades of official secrecy. By the time Mao Zedong died in 1976, the number of lives lost under his rule stood at an estimated 70 million. This figure, drawn from post-Mao demographic studies and survivor research, surpasses the combined death tolls of Hitler and Stalin. The devastation spanned famine, purges, forced labor, and waves of political violence. Yet, inside China, these numbers remain largely unspoken. School textbooks rarely mention the famine or the mass killings. Official histories focus on economic progress and national pride, while the memory of entire villages erased from the map is left to exiled scholars and private family stories. Even today, attempts to discuss these losses publicly can lead to censorship or punishment. The silence is not accidental. It is the final layer of denial, ensuring that the true scale of Mao's crimes remains hidden from the generations that followed. An estimated 70 million people died as a direct result of Mao Zedong's rule, according to post-Mao demographic studies and government archives. The evidence presented, official documents, survivor testimonies, and party records shows that Mao's policies created the world's deadliest famine, sanctioned mass murder during the Cultural Revolution, and built the largest forced labor system in history. Despite this, many official records remain classified, and the full extent of crimes like covert medical experimentation is still unknown. Today, Chinese textbooks often omit or downplay these events, and public discussion remains tightly controlled. What is clear from the available evidence is that Mao's legacy is defined by systematic state violence and the suffering of millions. The victims' stories, preserved in archives and eyewitness accounts, serve as a factual reminder. History's most powerful criminals can die in peace, but the truth endures in the documents they leave behind.